This is the Katz family in 1920, a German Jewish family of butchers that had lived in Rhineland, Germany for generations. The matriarch of the family was Johanna Katz, who was married to Arnold Katz. He had died in 1909. Karl, Henrietta, Ludwig, Danny, Rosa, Abba, and Benno were siblings. With the exception of Abba's wife Hedi, every adult in this picture had either died or was murdered in the camps by the end of 1944. Most of the youngest generation survived the Holocaust by finding refuge in other countries whilst they still could, though Ellen and Arnold were not as fortunate. By the time of this picture, Ludwig had not yet married Hermine Simon and had their children Lillian and Gerhard, both of whom were sent to concentration camps, with only the eldest, Lil, managing to survive. This documentary short explores the fate of members of the Katz family and their journeys from well-established, close-knit family lives in Germany to suddenly being forced to rejoin and fragment into the Jewish diaspora. Karl was married to Johanna Stern and had two sons, Helmut and Rudi. The family lived above their shop at 18 Severinstrasse in Cologne, where they all trained and worked as butchers. Johanna was loving and caring. She often helped out in the shop, enjoyed eating in good restaurants, appreciated beautiful clothing, loved theatre and music, and knew how to play the piano. Karl was a buoyant man with a great sense of humour, who loved hearing and telling jokes. When it came to work, however, he was very strict and a perfectionist. Once in a while, he would kick back at the nearby brewery. Sunday night was card game night with his brother Benno, often joined by his accountant and close friend Dagobert von Gelden. Benno was also married to a Johanna, proud parents of Adele and Arnold. Amongst other places, he worked at Cologne's slaughterhouse on Liebigstrasse. Henrietta, known as Jätchen, married Moritz Gutmann. Their children were Adolf, Ellen, and Arnold. Rosa was married to Sally Rosenthal. Abraham, or Abba, and Hedwig, or Hedi, were parents to Ellen and Fritz. Rosa, her husband Samuel or Sally Rosenthal, with Abba as their partner, ran the successful and widely known Katz Rosenthal butcher's shops. The main premises was on Ehrenstrasse, but the company grew to have 6 different locations and over 400 employees. They introduced the concept of lunch menus and self-service restaurants, which, though innovative and unusual at the time, are now staples in every butcher's shop. By the end of the 1920s, it was one of the largest retail companies of its kind in Germany, with an annual turnover of over 3 million Reichsmark. The family was very close. The wives, as well as the children, were good friends and visited each other regularly as they lived nearby in the southern old town of Cologne. The success of the family business, and no doubt the fact that they were Jewish, made them the unenviable focus of the local Nazi-owned newspaper, Westdeutscher Beobachter, which in 1928 began a relentless anti-Semitic smear campaign against Katz Rosenthal. It began when they claimed that the boxer Jacob Dom-Gurgen had found a mouse in his goulash. This resulted in a lengthy, well-publicized and costly court case which had a deep impact on the family and the business. Despite witnesses and both the butchery and sanitary department's statements to the contrary, the spurious claims were upheld, and eventually the damage suit and injunctions against the newspaper's chief editors Robert Ley and Joseph Grohe were dismissed, with the plaintiffs Katz Rosenthal bearing all costs. Sales of the newspaper had never been higher than during their creation and coverage of this scandal. When reflecting on the incident years later, Ley said, "Scandals like this were simply a means to awaken the drowsy masses. Many who picked up the Westdeutsche Beobachter to satisfy their craving for sensationalism inadvertently ingested National Socialist ideals in the process." Although Westdeutsche Beobachter tried their utmost to damage the Katz siblings' business by means of defamation and ongoing calls for boycotts, the family business continued to thrive, owing primarily to their loyal customers. However, the fortunes of the family progressively and significantly worsened after the rise to power of Hitler and the National Socialists in the early 1930s. Ludwig was most likely not in the mood to party on the 30th of January 1933. It was his 45th birthday, yet also the day that Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Most members of the family assumed the National Socialists would not last long in governmental politics. In addition, the family's liberal and assimilated lifestyle meant that they identified as inhabitants of Cologne, Rhineland, and Germany first, and Jewish second. Several sons of the family had done their duty fighting as soldiers in World War I and had been living in Rhineland for 6 generations. By 1933, Robert Ley, former editor-in-chief of Westdeutsche Beobachter, had risen to Reich Inspector and the national organizational leader. The former editor, Josef Grohe, had advanced to Gauleiter, or provincial governor, for Cologne. In the spring of that year, a large-scale boycott of Jewish businesses was being gleefully and violently enforced. On April the 1st, Benno and Arnold were removed from their shop and herded through the streets, being spat on, jeered at, and hit, while being made to carry anti-Semitic signs urging people not to buy from Jews. Katz Rosenthal customers were photographed and shamed as traitors for shopping at a Jewish business, and Nazi guards stood outside Jewish shops, intimidating customers who might want to enter. Also on April 1st, 1933, Karl's co-brother-in-law Richard Stern took a stand against the boycotts. With the Iron Cross that he had been awarded in the First World War proudly pinned to his chest, he stood next to the brown-shirted guard harassing his customers outside his upholstery business and instead handed them leaflets that he had designed himself, opposing the boycotts and informing them of his status as a decorated German soldier. A similar scene played out at 18 Severinstrasse in the southern old town of Cologne, where an SA guard was positioned outside of Karl's butchery to keep customers from entering the shop. His eldest son Helmut stood next to him in an attempt to intimidate with his sturdy frame and fearless attitude. Knowing it to be a dangerous game, and a losing one at that, Karl closed the shop to prevent further escalation. Abba and Hedi's marital problems became insurmountable when they separated for the 3rd time, and she left him for another man. The Katz's businesses were struggling under an increasingly hostile administration, and the family was frequently on the receiving end of anti-Semitic attacks. SA troops would gather outside their house, bellowing anti-Semitic chants and songs, which deeply disturbed Abba, who would retreat to the bathroom or closet and hold his ears. Abba's economic and social situation was no longer tolerable for him, and perhaps believing his professional and personal life to be over, on the evening of the 19th of October 1933, he took his own life, with a bolt gun he had brought home from the slaughterhouse. He was discovered on the bathroom floor the following morning by his daughter, Ellen. The Katz's butcheries were increasingly in the crosshairs of the National Socialists. Boycotts continued, and immense pressure was put on them to close down. Several of the family's properties were seized, and their shop windows were smashed by the Hitler Youth. Rosa, Sally, and Fritz sold off what they could, but left many of their possessions and property behind, as they, along with their co-owners of the main Katz Rosenthal butchery on Ehrenstrasse, Ludwig and Danny, all emigrated to the Netherlands with their families. Danny's health deteriorated after he was imprisoned for 20 weeks by the tax authorities. His wife, Dora, said they felt blackmailed and robbed by a band of criminals. Rosa and Sally struggled to settle, moving from The Hague to Amsterdam. Their new neighborhood there was home to many German Jewish immigrant families, including that of Anne Frank, who had traveled there from Frankfurt. Danny Katz died in Amsterdam in 1937, survived by his wife Dora and their children Renee and Marion. Living and work conditions for the family in Cologne were growing increasingly more intense by the day. Helmut described these changes when he was interviewed on a visit to Cologne in 1988.
Und das kam so nach und nach. Natürlich mit der Machtübernahme 1933 hat sich vieles geändert. Und dann nach diesem Boykotttag am 1. April, der natürlich eine Erschütterung war, aber danach hat sich das wieder so beigelegt. Man konnte wieder leben, ohne Angst zu haben, über die Straße zu gehen. Aber das hielt auch nicht lange an. 1934, 1935, da kamen immer mehr Maßnahmen, die einen beschränkt hatten.
At the behest of Cologne's mayor, the city administration banned Jewish livestock traders and Jewish butchers from entering slaughterhouse premises. Helmut got into a physical altercation after the SA had violently expelled all Jewish workers at the slaughterhouse.
Und eines Tages waren wir auf dem Kölner Schlachthof. Da waren wir immer montags und dienstags beschäftigt. Da wurden auf einmal alle Juden rausgeschmissen. Da kamen die SA-Lümmels und haben sie sozusagen in den Hintern getreten, Juden raus.
The story later told by his brother Rudi was that Helmut slapped a Nazi across the face and, having been a boxer, beat him to the ground in the process.
Und da habe ich mir gedacht, nee, das geht ja nicht so weiter auf die lange Dauer. Und eines Tages habe ich dann Freunde dort am Schlachthof, haben uns getroffen und die sagten mir, sie haben es satt, zu ziehen fahren nach Südafrika.
Due to the ever-worsening financial situation and knowing that confrontations with the Nazis would only increase in severity and frequency, Helmut emigrated in 1937. He travelled via Frankfurt to Basel and Geneva, and soon after he arrived in Italy, boarded a ship to South Africa.
Und innerhalb 2 Wochen waren wir weg am Schiff.
When Benno's son Arnold caught a severe bout of tuberculosis, he went to Davos in Switzerland for treatment, where he died on March 14, 1939. He was 27 years old. He had been traumatized by the public humiliation that he and his father had been subjected to on the streets of their hometown 6 years previously. Though he was deeply mourned by the family, it is unlikely that any of them were present at his funeral. Johanna stayed behind in their last home in Molkestrasse on August 14, 1939, too tearful to accompany Karl and her youngest son Rudi as he set off for England, a mere fortnight before the outbreak of the Second World War. Having travelled through Amsterdam, where he stayed briefly with his uncle Ludwig, Rudi made it to the UK just in time. However, he was later detained as an enemy alien in a camp on the Isle of Man due to his German citizenship. The following year, Karl died from cancer of the liver. Benno's wife, Johanna, known as Hanschen, died 2 weeks to the day after Karl's passing. The family members that remained in Cologne were forced to wear a yellow star sewn onto the left side of their clothes at all times. By September of 1941, the family started to receive deportation orders from the Gestapo. Amid appalling conditions, Benno and Adele were taken to a ghetto in Lodz and found a catastrophic situation upon their arrival. Johanna, now one of the last remaining family members in Cologne, penned her last letter to her loved ones on the 20th of November, 1941.
I hope that you're all in good health. The worst has come to pass. After saying farewell to our poor Berta last Sunday, I too have to go, like so many others. It was awfully hard letting go of my beloved Karl, and our dearly beloved, so relentless is death. tearing at the heart, and everything that I loved about my homeland. Married almost 30 years in Cologne, bore children, shared in the good and the bad times with the dear ones. This step is the hardest, the last one, as my heart, gallbladder and liver will not be able to bear it. I ask you to stick together, be there for each other. I can't continue any further. Feel tightly embraced. I always send love. Greet and kiss you, your Johanna.
The voice you just heard was Johanna's granddaughter and my mother, Marion Bruce, née Katz. We visited Cologne together in the summer of 2019 to tread in the footsteps of our ancestors, to get to know them and their city.
Your grandfather died here in 1940s.
We visited El Day House, the documentation centre in Cologne, where we met with Birte, who patiently talked us through the documents and pictures that they keep there related to our family.
Gives us the last address in Nordstraße.
We were moved by a mixture of emotions to see Benno, Arnold and Richard Stern on the walls of the exhibition whilst on our way around the museum there. However, much of the information about the Katz family in this video comes from this excellent book written by Michael Vieten that he published about them in 2017. As social worker and local historical researcher, Michael had lived on the Katz-Rosenthal premises on Ehrenstrasse and had been researching and writing about our family for many years. He kindly took us to the places where they lived and worked. On this day, he took us to Cologne railway station, from where Johanna and thousands of others were packed on trains bound for ghettos and then extermination camps in neighboring countries.
And from this place, 1942 and 41, more than 1,500 Sinti and Roma, and from 1941, more than 11,000 Jews were deported to the concentration camps.
In these steps went many people to their death.
On the 6th of December 1941, Johanna Katz finalized packing the possessions she was permitted to take and those she was ordered to bring, and made her way to Cologne railway station. The family friend and bookkeeper, Dagobert von Gelden, had also been summoned to the railway station that day. He commented in a letter at the time that at least she wouldn't have to travel by herself this way, and so he accompanied her as they began a perilous journey to a fate unknown. Richard Stern later wrote of Mr. von Gelden in a letter to Rudy, "We will never forget him. He was your family's loyal friend until the very end, and will always remain this way." They and thousands of others were made to sleep in the building across from the station, waiting until their transport was ready to deport them the next day.
So that she would have seen places when she left.
Yeah.
We know that Johanna was on a transport bound for Riga on December the 7th, 1941. We don't know exactly what happened to her after that. Next to her name was written Vermögen, meaning that she had property, all of which was eventually taken.
If she survived the trip, but I guess she survived, but they had to walk fast to the ghetto, not to a camp, it was a ghetto.
Okay, yeah.
And these people who weren't able to do that were shot.
Right.
So
They couldn't walk fast enough, they were shot.
Haben
die keine Gelegenheit mehr zur Auswanderung gehabt?
Je länger man gewartet hat, nachher waren alle Türen verschlossen in der Welt. Verschiedene Leute sind einfach über die Grenze und haben gedacht, ach, irgendetwas wird schon. Aber die waren alle so konventionell, die ohne ein Visa zu haben, um eine normale Einreise zu haben, haben die es alle nicht gewagt, aus Deutschland rauszugehen. Andere Leute haben das gehabt und haben es überlebt.
Also im Grunde auch zu lange gewartet.
Exactly. Naja, das ist es.
Despite their pleas and written appeals, Adele and her father Benno were taken to Chelmno extermination camp on May 10, 1942. They were led onto a truck and then suffocated as the exhaust fumes were pumped inside during their 5-kilometer journey to the camp in the woods, where their corpses were buried and later burnt. It came as a complete surprise in June 1942 when Ludwig's wife Hermine died at the age of 48 in Amsterdam, having contracted meningitis. She was buried alongside her brother-in-law Danny in Wiedeberg Cemetery. Only 2 months later, Ludwig, Gerhard, Lillian, and Hermine's sister Paula Simon were arrested and taken to Westerbork transit camp. Sally and Rosa Rosenthal were also arrested in Amsterdam and taken to the same camp on September 10th. They were deported to Auschwitz from there only 2 weeks later, where they were killed in the gas chamber shortly after their arrival on September 28th. As the last members of the family left in Cologne, Henrietta, known as Jettchen, and Moritz, known as Moses, were there for the heavy air raids by English bombers in the spring of 1942. The fear for their lives was mixed with the hope that the Nazis might be defeated. But the bombings did nothing to halt the deportations, and in July they too had to report to Köln-Deutz railway station to be forcibly expelled to Theresienstadt, near Prague, which contained the Terezin concentration camp. The conditions they entered into there were harrowing, as by then 40,000 people were made to live in no more than a single square kilometer. Jettchen's brother Ludwig, along with his son Gerhard or Gerti, and sister-in-law Paula, were among them there, though it is not known if they crossed paths. In any case, Jettchen and Moritz were deported to Auschwitz and killed in the gas chamber on the 15th of May, 1944. Lillian and her husband Paul were two of the last people to be deported from Westerbork to Terezin, where she was briefly reunited with her father, brother, and aunt. However, they were deported to Auschwitz only a few weeks later on October 28th. Lillian's request to accompany them was denied, as she was sent to work in a bomb factory. She said in a letter she wrote to Rudy,
"I do not need to describe what it means to see all your loved ones go, knowing that they will not be returning. It is as though a piece of your brain and heart is taken away from you."
Her father Ludwig, Aunt Paula, and her 14-year-old brother Gerti were all gassed to death in Auschwitz 2 days later on October 30th, 1944. A year later, and just before the Nazis could execute their plan to murder the remaining inmates, Terezin concentration camp was liberated by the Red Army. Lillian, by then the sole survivor of her immediate family, returned to Amsterdam in June 1945 with nothing but the shirt on her back. This and millions of other families were devastated by the gradual but increasingly brutal persecution by their fellow Germans under the fascist regime of the Third Reich. However, those that were able to leave in time and make lives for themselves in foreign countries became grandparents themselves. Jettchen and Morris Gutman's children all emigrated to Africa in the mid-1930s, with Ellen and Adolf, from then on known as Shigo, settling and raising families in South Africa, and their older brother Arno in Rhodesia. Here they are, reunited in Johannesburg, when Helmut and his third wife Miriam visited Ellen, Arno, Shigo, and his wife Lottie. By then, Helmut was more commonly called Harry, and had moved to England in 1962, prompted to emigrate once more when the police enforcing apartheid became eerily reminiscent of the Nazi enforcers, the SA, and not wishing to make the same mistake his parents had, he left while he was still able. Abba's daughter Ellen and husband Kurt went into hiding in Belgium and managed to survive the war with the help of locals in the countryside there. When they were liberated on the 3rd of September 1944, they realized that they had been hiding where they were least expected to be found, in a neighborhood Ellen later described as a nest of Nazis. After successfully opening butcheries in the Netherlands, Fritz settled in New York City with his wife Hilda, where he became a wealthy meat trader, and they raised their daughter, Eleanor. His mother Hedy also lived out her life there. Dora, Marion, and Renee survived the war in Switzerland, and Dora even returned to Cologne to ensure compensation for the unlawful expropriation that her husband Danny had suffered. After a brief period living in South Africa with her uncle, Arthur Simon, Lil lived in the Netherlands until her death in 1989. She had a daughter, Nikki, and lived to become a grandmother. She had a fun, mischievous character, but was deeply impacted by the trauma she had suffered, and strictly avoided the house in Amsterdam where her father and brother had been arrested. Rudy capitalized on the skills that he learnt in the family business when he settled in England, becoming a wealthy butcher specializing in cured ham. By then going by his middle name Michael, he is credited with inventing Easy Carve and honey roast ham. While he was master of the Butchers Guild, he met the Queen and was given an OBE that was presented to him by Prince Charles. Having remained in Hitler's Germany for 2 more years after his older brother had left, Michael had different and perhaps more disturbing memories of his hometown and never returned to Cologne. Unlike Harry, who visited his old friends there several times. As both adopted the UK as their new home though, they remained close throughout their lives. When Harry, then Helmut, left Germany, he did so with around 10 other friends, many of whom he remained in touch with the rest of their lives. One of them was Walter Katz from Greffenbruch. When they were saying goodbye to their families, Helmut briefly met Walter's sister, Lieselotte, or Liesel, who was there to wave off her older brother. Once settled in South Africa, by then working at a precursor for McDonald's, named Uncle Willie's, Harry married the owner of the sandwich bar's daughter, Gerda, and in 1939 they had a son named Ronald. But after the marriage collapsed, he joined the South African Air Force and was posted to North Africa. Whilst on leave, he visited Palestine. Liesel had recently emigrated there, so Walter suggested Harry get in touch with his younger sister. It was there that they fell in love, and in Cairo where they got married, before returning to raise a family in South Africa. Liesel's maiden name was coincidentally also Katz. Her family, from a small rural town on the outskirts of Cologne, were traders in livestock. In the next video, we look at what happened to her side of the family, as they too were involved in a court case arising from anti-Semitic persecution, and were also gradually forced out of their homeland. Yet again, we are blessed with the help of another compassionate, curious German citizen and local historical researcher, Ulrich Herlitz, who dedicates himself to shining a light on the Jewish Germans who once thrived in his town.
The Jewish people were in the 8th, 9th generation in Greffenbruch, so they're the oldest inhabitants, the oldest families of Greffenbruch.
He guides us around the town where Liesel grew up, amongst her grandparents, parents, uncles, aunts, cousins and friends. Ulrich tells us their stories with the aid of documents he unearthed. We are taken to the places where our ancestors lived and worked, and are reconnected to our long-lost but much beloved family members.